Hi everyone, so in this video we're going to be looking at the idea of professional values, those things that we deem to be important as teaching professionals. As you know, this is your first opportunity at getting stuck into your Module 1 assignment, so hopefully this will be a useful video giving you some things to think about and giving you some practical tips to getting a good draft together. So in this video we're going to look at a few things. Firstly, we're going to look at the idea of values themselves, what they are, where they come from. We're going to do some work in identifying our own personal professional values, as well as the values of the wider higher education sector. Then we're going to problematize the idea of values, look at some of the issues that arise when we're trying to discuss them or trying to work with them, trying to be value-led people. And I'm going to end by suggesting a useful framework that you could engage with to improve your writing. So when we begin by looking at values, obviously it helps to kind of think about what they are. It turns out they're quite slippery, and a lot of the discussions around values, particularly in political debate, tend to be quite fuzzy, right, on the distinction between what they are. So for us, right, we just think at this point the values are the concerns that we have about what ought to be, right? So they're kind of beliefs, they're concepts that help us think about how the world should be, what kind of right is, what good is. And the idea is that these beliefs, they guide or underpin the actions that we take more generally in the world, but specifically we're thinking about the values we have that guide or underpin our actions as teachers. Now, to make it slightly more complex, values are related to, but they are actually subtly different from other kinds of beliefs we might have about the world, different aims we have about achieving the values that we have, or kind of more general attitudes and behaviours. So to unpack an example, an attitude that I hold is that I don't eat meat. So that's a behaviour that I don't actually engage in that case. So there might be several aims at play. The aim might be to get healthy. Equally, the aim might be to reduce environmental damage, right? So you can see there's a particular reason why I've taken that attitude, and that is founded on a belief. So the aim of getting healthy might be founded on the belief that eating meat has lots of fat, makes you store fat, or the belief that the modern meat industry increases ecological damage. Well, that would lead to the aim of reducing environmental damage, right? Now, values are sort of a level deeper than that, right? So I might value my health, or value the idea that being a fit person is good. Therefore I take this aim to get healthy, which is made sense by a particular belief and leads to a particular attitude. Similarly, I could actually value the planet, or value the human race collectively caring for the planet. That again would lead through beliefs, through aims, to a particular attitude. Now you can see that's quite complex itself, and it's often hard to distinguish between the things that we view to be personally important from the things that are important to us as professionals. Now hopefully there wouldn't be a massive gap between the two of those, but we are talking about our professional values, and I think it's interesting to just kind of hold in your heads whether those are different from other forms of values that you have. Similarly, it's interesting to think about how the values that we hold personally might relate and compare to society as a whole, or to the institution that we work in. So you can see in a way that the values that we have sort of become a compass for us. As I said, they guide or underpin our actions. So they can help define what we view as a priority. They in some way define the methods that are acceptable to achieve those priorities, and they aid or kind of frame our decision making in particular ways. Often going back to your values is really helpful if you're in very complex or messy situations. You have to go back, reel it back and work out, okay, what do I actually think is right in this situation? So effectively, they become a yardstick for how we actually judge success. What we actually think is right or appropriate in given situations, consciously or unconsciously. So there's actually quite a lot of research out there, particularly recent research in curriculum development, that puts value systems right at the start of the curriculum process. This idea that the pedagogies we choose, the kinds of outcomes that we deem to be important, maybe the use of learning outcomes at all, are all defined by a particular value system. And most educational debate, particularly that's going on in the public eye, or political debate, kind of conveniently leaves out the issue of values and the idea of there being different value systems at play there. So, for example, one of the values I hold is that I actually value students as being more than just a student, more than just kind of a brain in a vat or a set of limbs that can play the drums. And I think in education, students should be recognised as human beings. So that becomes one of my kind of markers of what I think good educational practice is. Helps define some of my priorities in terms of course design, certainly defines some of the methods I choose when working with people, and helps me make decisions in certain situations, say in advocating for the student's best interest. So you'll no doubt already have some ideas about the values that you hold, but here's a bit of a thought starter or a way to kind of broaden some of that thinking. This is a quick inventory of different values that you might hold. So I'm going to skip through a whole load of things, and I'm just going to ask you to think about how highly you'd rate these. How important do you think these things are within education? So you can watch through, or you can maybe stop after each one, have a think, maybe give them a rating out of 10, but in some way just process to yourself, how highly do you think these rate? So helping students tends to be one of the first things that people think about in education, but how important is actually helping the person in front of you to education? How about helping society through education? How about valuing freedom? Maybe the freedom of students, the freedom of yourself as a professional, or creativity. How about the value of equality and everyone having equal access, equal opportunity, maybe? How about intellectual stimulation? The idea that education should actually be really engaging on an intellectual level. How about respect? Perhaps from students to you, you to students, everyone to each other. How highly would you rank power on authority within education? How important is it for people to be recognised as human beings, or recognised for the work that they produce? How about variety or innovation? How about valuing safety, maybe on a practical level, maybe on a kind of emotional, relational level, there being a safe learning environment? And does that relate to the idea of challenge in education as well? How about valuing enjoyment, learning and education actually being something that's fun for students? Do you have any particular moral or ethical kind of rules and guidelines that you think are kind of highly valued? How important are relationships within the learning process? How important is the fact of student achievement? Them actually being successful in maybe within the education system, maybe beyond the education system. So just think for yourself, each one of those, how important do you think those are? And do you see a top 3 Is there anything that really sticks out to you, or maybe aligns with some other thinking that you did way back at the beginning of the course? So take some time to yourself and see if you can articulate these as a value. For example, I value variety in education because blah. I value student freedom, students being free to learn and to have choices over their own learning because. Great. So those are our personal values, or beginning to unpack some of the things that we deem to be important. Let's have a look at the rest of the sector. So, as you know, we work within higher education. BIM is a higher education institution. Now, the Higher Education Academy is the professional body in the UK for good practice in HE, and they've got this document called the Professional Standards Framework for Teaching and Supporting Learning in HE, shortened to the UK PSF. So you'll be engaging with this all the way through your course. You've probably seen it already, and you may have noticed that professional values are something that the HEA deem to be incredibly important. They actually think that the values that we embrace, we exemplify, they're central to professionalism. So going a little bit further in, there are actually 4 specific values that the HEA identify, right? So I'm quite interested in what you guys think of these, because it's not like you have to fully agree in any particular way. The HEA don't want you to just state that you do all of these things and that's it. They're interested in your personal values and your take. So I'm kind of interested in how much these align with your own personal values and how you might actually view these things in light of your professional contexts. So number 1, V1, the HEA says that we should respect individual learners and diverse learning communities. That's their first value. So, how do we respect the different individual experiences, the different backgrounds, different communities that students are part of and that come from? Within BIM there might be the different learning communities of local international students, or maybe different genres that people identify with, or gender, sexuality, race, all of these different things. Value 2, to promote participation in higher education and the equality of opportunity for learners. This idea that it doesn't actually matter where you come from, everyone should have an equal opportunity to engage with what higher education is in a meaningful way. So again, is that something that aligns with what you believe? Is that something that you focus to do, to try and help all different kinds of students engage with the learning? V3, using evidence-informed approaches and the outcomes from research, scholarship and continuing professional development. So either for yourself or with your students, the kinds of activities that people engage in, the learning, the knowledge, are these actually based on evidence? Are these actually based on contemporary research and people knowing what they're doing and seeking to understand what they're doing more fully? And V4, acknowledge the wider context in which higher education operates, recognising the implications for professional practice. So for you, is there a link between BIM as a higher education establishment and the wider context of HE, the wider context of the music industry? How do we relate as higher education professionals to all of these different areas? How do we help our students recognise and engage in their own practices as professional musicians? How do we help them engage with the professional learning community, the music industry in this case? So what do you think of these values? Do you agree? Do they align with what you think? And do you see specific ways in which these are kind of true for you in your practice at the moment? Great. So at the moment we're just talking about values as if they're kind of correct or simple. But it turns out, as with most things, they're slightly more problematic than they first appear. So in the nature of the PG Cert being a master's level qualification, we're just going to be a bit critical, and we're going to question some of these ideas, look at some of the issues that arise. Firstly, there's the issue of the values gap. So we talked a little bit earlier about espoused versus enacted values. Essentially, this is just the difference between the beliefs, the values that we hold, that we tell other people that we hold, and the actions that we take. Funnily enough, there's a lot of research going on at the moment about the gap between, say the explicit values of an institution or a kind of corporation and what they actually do in the world. I often think if someone who didn't know me, observed my behaviours, say for a period of 2 weeks, what would they say my own values are? What would they say that I value? Because often it's really hard for us to unpack actually what we do in the world. So it's like we're never going to fully reduce this gap. We're never going to be completely congruent. But I think it's the work of a professional person to try and be more authentic and to try and hold our own values in our actions as much as we can. So, for example, one of the values I hold is I value lifelong learning, both for myself and my students. I think that learning should be something that doesn't just happen in the classroom, right? So that's an espoused value that I hold. The way that I enact that, well, I seek to promote lifelong learning through modelling my own reflective learning to my students, and also encouraging them to link and to discuss how a module could connect with, say, their future careers. Those are two ways of enacting that value. Well, if I'm being a bit critical and I want to evaluate that, maybe that's somewhat successful. Hopefully it's going well, but maybe the modelling of my own learning processes, if I do that too much, would that not maybe limit my students' own creativity or them taking their own independent, autonomous solutions to things? That could be an unintended consequence of trying to model this thing that I want them to do. Great. So enacted versus espoused values, the values gap. I think that's one problem with the idea of values. The second one we've touched upon already, and that's the idea that values themselves are quite slippery things. Actually trying to define what they are, where they come from, whether values are universal or they're specific to people. It turns out there are lots of debates still about these big questions. So one of the ideas is whether one of the questions rather is whether values are inherent, they're universal, or whether they are constructed depending on different social and cultural factors. So this idea of kind of firm, true values that are universal across different cultures is quite slippery. It's been challenged a lot within the academy, within research at the moment. And it turns out that our notion of values tends to be very much informed by the beliefs that we hold, by the kind of ideologies that we're a part of. And those values that we hold also tend to kind of we build them from our upbringing, from personal experiences, and they're kind of coded to us depending on what our society, what the culture that we're a part of also views as values. So there's this kind of complex interaction between our own independent experience and how we process, the things that happen to us as a child. But then we also learn lessons from society in a kind of broader sense. And, I think that's problematic anyway. But it's basically been shown that the values that societies have, they change depending on culture. And even within a given society, they change over time. For example, this idea of equality, if you went back 100, 200 years ago, people still might have believed in the idea of equality. That might still have been a value, but it wouldn't have been the same kind of equality that we view now. There was a much bigger gap in terms of men and women or different races. There were certain groups of people that were actually just excluded from the idea of who should be equal to whom. So if you're interested in some of that, there's an organisation called the World Value Survey, and they've done some fantastic qualitative research where they compare the different values of different cultures, different countries, and they've seen them grow over time. So you can look at some kind of mapping that they do, and you can literally see the change in different societal values in different areas of the world. It's absolutely fascinating. So, depending on whether you view moral values as being relative or being absolute, kind of either way, it's certainly helpful to think about where your values come from and how they're formed. Again, the other thing we've touched on is the idea that, well, it's not just us. Actually we're operating in institutions with different colleagues, and in wider society, and there are going to be people that have different values from us, and that might bring us into value conflict. So, as I said, we often encounter situations where we have to engage with people that have different values to ours, or maybe just disagree on how values that we share, how they should be enacted, the methods that are fine to get to those aims. This idea of equality or the value of freedom, they can be interpreted in lots of different ways. They're somewhat messy. Perhaps our own values also change depending on our own contexts. As I've said, personal versus professional values. So lots of different examples here, but the idea is that unrecognised value conflict can seriously mess up the work that we do. So we need to recognise these things. We need to talk about it. We need to have discussions about values more in education, I think. Rather than just staying at the level of method, we need to talk about the method of value as well. The level of value as well. So for yourself, what are the different value systems that you engage with? Maybe there's the personal, maybe there's the professional, maybe there's educational value versus music value. Maybe it's the value systems of BIM versus the value systems of the wider music industry. See what's important to you and different and interesting in the work that you do. Great. So, as a final piece, I've got one suggested approach that you can take when writing up your reflective report with this. So, in 2 columns, or you can just kind of note down on a piece of paper. Firstly, maybe have a go at listing all of the different professional values that you hold as a teacher. These values that you espouse. In the second column, what are the ways in which you enact those values? How do you actually put these things into practice? Have you got some specific examples, some specific methods you use to try and achieve those values? For example, I try to ensure that my knowledge of teaching is as up to date as possible. So I read widely and attend teaching conferences. Or I aim to show respect for all my learners, and I do that through ensuring everyone is included in activities, soliciting different points of view in discussions, etc. Great, simple. So you've got 2 columns. Add a third one. So number 1, what are your main professional values? How do you put these into practice? And then how successful is this? So thinking of a very clear and specific example, if possible. What are the successes? What are the challenges you've faced in enacting those values? And is there any particular gap between where you are now and where you want to be? So I hope that's helpful. I'll look forward to seeing you on the blog. Have fun with it.